And today I'm joined by Dr. Guglielmo Briscese from the Behavioural Insights Team. So look, I think it's been proven time and time again that diverse teams of different cultural backgrounds, ethnicities, gender, etc., produce more effective, creative results than teams of one or no diversity. I'm sure all of you out there have got diversity targets you're working to, and this is a huge topic right now in recruitment, which is why we're very lucky to have been joined by Dr. Guglielmo. Now, just before I hand over to him, I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about Adzuna, of course, why we're putting this on. So for those of you who don't know, we're a job search engine or aggregator, or a Google for jobs, and we've got about 130,000 jobs on our website. But what we have uniquely in Australia is a partnership with Fairfax Media. Now, this enables us to not only recruit active talent that exists on our site, but we also can then amplify your ads all across 150 to 200 other sites to get the active user again, but more importantly, probably the passive user in any regional or metro area. So look, I'd really urge you after this to try something different. Try us, contact us, and give us a go as such. It's 2018, the year of digital experimentation. Okay, without further ado then, I shall hand over to the expert who can talk to us about why diversity, etc., is so important.
Great. Well, thank you. Thanks for having me here today. So what I'd like to talk to you today about is behavioral economics. And probably some of you have heard what behavioral economics is all about, but for those of you who have not heard the term before, basically behavioral economics is this growing field which is at the intersection of economics and psychology. And the underpinning principle behind behavioral economics is that if we take a more realistic model of human behavior, we can design better policies and programs, both in government as well as in private sector organizations. So human beings are not these rational individuals, utility maximizers that traditional economics want us to believe. We are subject to heuristics and biases, and by better understanding how we fall victim of these biases, we can actually design systems and processes and policies that can help us make better decisions for ourselves and for others. So we've been applying at the Behavioural Insights team, behavioural economics, behavioural insights across a broad range of policy areas, from education to employment, transport, crime, health, and so on. Today, I'd just like to talk to you about how we've been applying this approach to recruitment, specifically about human resources. So before I talk about some examples, I'd like to start this presentation with a couple of quizzes. So if you have a piece of paper and a pen in front of you, just write down the answers to the following questions. So the very first question is, was Mahatma Gandhi older or younger than 100 years old when he died? Just write down your answer. And the second question is, how old was Mahatma Gandhi when he died? Don't Google it, just write down your best guesstimate. Okay?
And while we're asking questions, please feel free to ask questions in the chat and we can answer them as we go through.
Great. So, same quiz. Was Marlon Brando older or younger than 50 years old when he died? And the last question is, how old was Marlon Brando when he died? So just write down younger, older, and then how old was Marlon Brando when he died? Now, when we ask these questions in workshops or presentations, and then we ask people to raise their hand to guess whether Gandhi or Marlon Brando died at a certain age, the first answer that people give is that Mahatma Gandhi probably died younger than 100 years old, simply because 100 is a big number. And when we ask them to provide the best guesstimate, people come up with answers such as 90 something or 85, 89, and so on. Same thing with Marlon Brando. People think, well, surely he must have died older than 50 years old. But if I had to guess, maybe 60, 65, or 70. Now, when we look at the actual numbers, we see that Marlon Brando died at 80, whilst Mahatma Gandhi died at 78. Now, what happened there? What happened is that I gave you a couple of cues, right? A couple of signals. The very first signal was a number. In the first question for Gandhi, I gave you the number 100, and for Marlon Brando, I gave you the number 50. And people started basically providing guesstimate based on that number that I gave you. So from 100 people go down, from 50 people go a little bit up, but not too high up.
Does Marlon Brando have cut through these days for the younger audience?
Probably, yeah. Well, I hope so. Like, if you don't know who Marlon Brando is, I strongly
look it up.
recommend. Yeah, look it up and watch a couple of great movies of Marlon Brando. And the other the other signal that we gave you was the picture, right? So I gave you a picture of an old Gandhi and a picture of a young Marlon Brando. And you can see how easy it is to make wrong assumptions based on some couple of information that you probably thought that were not even important, right? When I asked you to guess the age of these two characters. Now, what happens is that this is an effect that is known in psychology as anchoring effect, or anchoring or signaling effect, where basically you make certain decisions based on some numbers or some information or some visual cues that someone else might have given you. And if you have to think about where does that apply in the real world, as opposed to just a funny quiz, well, it applies in recruitment. And there's probably something quite scary when you think about these effects when it comes to recruitment, specifically when we think about CVs. CVs in traditional economics are actually studied as a signaling game. So I have a piece of paper and I write down a bunch of information that I want to send you, where I can provide signals about my qualities, my experience, and my skills to you, and you can think about how worth it that information is. And you will probably choose also like whether you want to hire me or not, and also how much you think you want to pay me based on that information. But there's so many aspects of the CVs that actually distract you from making the best decision as an employer. There's cues such as the picture or the date of birth that a lot of people still put on CVs. Now that can lead to some age discrimination. Am I too old or too young for the specific job, right? You can also infer, for instance, my socioeconomic status by looking at the area where I live. If I provide my residential address, you can think about my background and even my political views sometimes based on where I live and where I'm based. And these are all information. The same applies, with typos or like if I have any gap in my employment history and so on. Now, these are all informations that are actually not that important for you to choose whether or not you want to hire me or not. But somehow they distract you, whether deliberately or not, from making the best decision when it comes to recruitment.
So you're saying before you even read about their skill set, you already have sort of made a prejudgment.
Immediately, absolutely. And you might not even know, you might not even be aware that you're making that judgment. But somehow on the back of your head, you are doing that, right? And that applies to age, to gender, to, again, status and so on. Now, I want to show you an example of a study that was done by Harvard academics, where they actually measured how important this type of information is. And what they did in this experiment in the US, they applied to vacancies that were posted online, and they applied to by sending CVs of fictional candidates, basically. And they prepared two identical CVs. The only thing that they changed in these two CVs was the name of the applicants. For a group of vacancies, they applied using a white name, like a white-sounding name. And for another group, they applied using a name of a candidate that sounded like an African-American name. And what you see here from this slide is that for those that had a white person name, they received on average about 50% more callbacks from employers. So that means that a white name on a CV was equivalent to about 8 years of experience, right? So these CVs were virtually identical. And again, you probably are not hiring the best person there if you are victim of these basically biases. Now that is quite interesting, right? Because we like to think when it comes to recruitment or HR as like investments in initiatives and strategies to diversify our workforce or making sure that it's a more inclusive company and so on and so forth. But sometimes it's these small changes that can have a huge effect. It can be as simple as asking people to submit a CV without their name on it. And at the end of the day, what's in a name? So it's Shakespeare. So it's not that important, right? Like the information that you need is about experience and the skill set. So we've applied these insights from academia in real world policy at BAT. And we ran an experiment with the Australian Department of Employment. So the Australian Department of Employment has a program that is called wage subsidy, and it consists in financial incentives for companies that hire disadvantaged job seekers.
Right.
So if you're an employer, you get contacted usually by a job center, right, a job service provider, and they say, look, I've got a candidate that I think is quite right for your vacancy. And by the way, there's also like up to $10,000 for you to, provide that training or induction to this employee because they just happen to be a little bit more disadvantaged than others. Right? Now, traditional economics says that financial incentives always work. If you want people to do something, pay them and they will do it. Right? In this case, something was going wrong, and the department realized that there was quite a low uptake of these financial incentives. And so they asked BAT to spend a bit of time in these job centers, and we listened to some of these conversations that staff had with employers. What we realized is that most of the times that these wage subsidies were being mentioned, the very first reaction from employers was, what's wrong with this person that you have to pay me to hire them? Right? And now that makes sense, and that's exactly where behavioral economics come into place. And so we ran an experiment and we said, okay, how about we just change the way we frame and present these financial incentives? So we changed the title. We called it an employment bonus to have more attractive, basically effect, an attractive name. And we also changed the way the payment installments worked. Right. So instead of just paying you everything up front or everything at the end, I will just pay you little by little. And that sort of gave the idea that this was like a long-term relationship, right, between the employee and the employer. And what we found is that led to an increase in hiring of disadvantaged job seekers that were eligible for these wage subsidies. Now, that is an example of how we applied these behavioral economics insights to change the behavior of employers. So we try to understand a little bit better how they really behave and make these incentives a little bit more attractive to them. We also did the same thing on changing behavior of job seekers. What we realized is that job seekers, when they apply for jobs and they want to write down a CV, they usually just Google CV templates, and there's a million things that you can find out there. And unfortunately, a lot of these templates still have this information that you actually should not have, right, in these CVs. And same applies to cover letters. So what we did was creating a website that was as user-friendly and simple as possible. And in this website, we provided some tips on how to apply and look for jobs. And also we provided a template for a CV and a template for a cover letter. Okay. And again, we reviewed these templates and made sure that they were as free from potential biases as possible. Okay. And we then emailed thousands of job seekers using a randomized control trial. And what we found is that those job seekers that had access to our website and access to our templates were actually 5% on average more likely to find a job.
Wow.
So we increased.
How can you be so precise about that impact then?
Yeah, so most of our studies are randomized control trials, and this we think is the gold standard of evaluation, especially in policy. It consists in basically randomly allocating a group of individuals to business as usual, where nothing changes, and a group of individuals to your intervention, right? So your trial, your experiment. In this case was an email directing you to this website to download these templates. So in this particular case, we partnered with a job service provider. They had about 20 offices around Sydney region, and we randomly allocated these offices to control or treatment, so business as usual versus the website treatment. And then we compare the outcomes by controlling for job seeker characteristics. So we can be quite sure that the characteristics of job seekers and job service providers, job sites in controlling treatment were as similar as possible. So in this case, we can be confident that in 95%, 95 out of 100 cases, our effect is not due to chance.
I mean, 5% maybe doesn't sound like a lot, but I think we all in recruitment know that it can just take one good candidate to change everything, right?
Absolutely.
So in fact, it is significant.
And if you think about how much money is invested in fixing unemployment, right? When you switch on the TV or read the newspaper, it seems that everything's about jobs, right? So every politician will talk about jobs. Everyone in policy will talk about jobs. They are considered to be the key priority, right? And a top item on anyone's agenda. And when you fix unemployment by simply creating a user-friendly website with a couple of good templates, and you increase employment by 5%, 5% is a huge number when you scale it up. We're talking about thousands of people that would otherwise have been unemployed for much longer. And obviously that generates substantial savings as well. Now we've been applying these principles also in our own recruitment process. So BAT, just because we are behavioral scientists, doesn't mean that we're not victims of the same biases as everyone else.
I'll just see a quick. I don't know if it's a question or more of a comment. Sorry, I'm leaning in here. It was saying basically, from Catherine, I remember that reading bias actually works against women in the gender bias studies. It's better to know that a woman wrote the application to get fair distribution of callbacks. So what do you?
I'm not sure which
question or a statement.
I'm not sure which study they're referring to. I know there's been a study that has been done recently that sort of contradicts a little bit, seems to contradict this thing that blinding applications can help. But my understanding is that by re-looking at the analysis, actually, it confirms, sort of supports like previous findings. So what we know is that there's a number of areas where blinding CVs is important for gender equality as well. And there's a number of other initiatives that we can take also to address that gender inequality in the recruitment process. But sometimes it really depends on the context as well. So sometimes if an employer has specific statement, for instance, where they really encourage female applicants, then maybe the recruiters that know that that's important and they're really looking to hire more female applicants, then in that case, you might not want to remove that information, right? So it's case by case. And I think that was the case of an experiment that was done in the public sector here in Australia. But there's another study done by Professor Libran from Monash University that shows, for instance, how the gender pay gap is also due to basically the job ads. And in this study, if I remember correctly, what they did was basically testing the impact of affirmative action or not, as well as testing the impact of having the line that says the salary is negotiable or not. So it turns out that from a gender point of view, if the salary is not negotiable or if it's not stated explicitly, most men will still negotiate the salary during the job interview process. And most women won't do that. But the moment you add that line and say salary is negotiable, that actually increases substantially and significantly the proportion of female applicants that will negotiate their salary.
Great.
And when you think about when you think about the gender pay gap, it starts from the very beginning, right? Obviously, if you have a good start with a salary, then the chances are that you are slightly more likely to, be able to progress in your career, salary-wise.
Okay, thanks.
So as I said, we've been applying these principles also internally at BAT, and we know that we are victims, of the same biases as anyone else, and doesn't matter how careful we are, we still get this misleading information. So we said, maybe CVs are not the right thing, to do for recruitment. Maybe we should think about something else. So normally when we recruit at BAT, we have like a multi-stage process of recruitment. At the beginning, candidates have to take part in a multiple choice test. Then those who pass that test, in the old version, they will get screened through a CV. So we would check their CVs and see if they were suitable or not for the job. And then from there, you were invited to an assessment center where you had like group tasks and so on, group presentations. Then after that, the people that passed that stage will be invited for a final interview, and then there will be like a reference check and the usual things that most companies do. Now, what we wanted to do is to see what happens if we remove that CV screening step in the recruitment process. And we replaced it with what we now call the applied platform, but back then was basically this system where we asked candidates to take part in further tests. And these tests were anonymous, so we didn't know who answered what. And the answers were assessed by everyone in the company, so not just HR or the line managers. So everyone took part in this assessment. Everyone had specific scoring metrics that they had to use to evaluate the answers. And these answers were also evaluated in chunks. So I wouldn't just evaluate all your answers, but I will evaluate everyone's answers to question A, then question B, and then question C, and so on. So that you compare horizontally rather than vertically. So that you wouldn't be affected by potentially the fact that you might have answered very well one question but not so well the second one. So I just evaluate everyone in the most objective way as possible. And then what we did at the very beginning was basically randomly allocating some candidates between the business as usual CV versus this new system, right? And we later on looked at the data and we compared the scores of candidates in the assessment center and the final interview versus the scores they would have got in the CV versus applied. Now, what we see here from these graphs is that applied scores actually were quite good indicators of how well people would have performed later on in the interviews, right, in the assessment center. If we look instead at the scores that people got from the CVs, they're basically as good as random. So we might as well have hired people by tossing a coin, right? Okay. And the same thing is with the final interview. Now, what that tells us basically is that there is some value for companies as well to remove this recruitment. It's not just about the social responsibility of a corporation by saying, we want to improve diversity and social inclusion and so on and so forth. It's really more about, I really want to hire the best people. And it turns out that their names, their gender, their age, surprisingly, are not that important, right? And there is one simple way to do that, basically, to make better decisions for your companies, to remove these things that lead you to make better decisions for the company. And based on these tests, then Applied became actually a platform, and it's spun out of BAT. So now it's an independent company that provides this very user-friendly platform that hundreds and I think by now thousands of companies all around the world are using. So it's great.
So what's the name of the platform?
Applied.
Applied.
Yeah. So this is about it. So basically, the two principles behind what we do at the Behavioural Insights team is the application of insights from behavioral sciences, behavioral economics, and robust testing. And again, as I mentioned before, we do this testing through randomized controlled trials where possible, so that we are able to see what works, what doesn't, and why. And the mantra of BAT is that sometimes small changes can have a big effect. So sometimes you don't have to think about investing hundreds of thousands of dollars in government programs or corporate policies to fix something when it comes to recruitment or HR or staff motivation and so on. But it's just about these small cues.
So I've just seen a question on here. Now it's referring to the IT sector, saying that seems all very well and good, I guess. I mean, the results sound interesting or effective, but how long does this process take, I think? So the question related to IT saying, look, you've got to have a really fast process because it's so competitive in that industry that if it takes too long, you've lost that candidate in the second round because they've been snapped up by somebody else. So how effectively or fast can you implement something like this?
Yeah, so look, in the case of Applied, you basically you receive an email if you're an employee that has been selected as an assessor. And I think it's up to you how many questions you want, obviously, candidates to take part in and answer. But you might receive an email as an assessor, a member of the company, and sometimes it takes as quick as half an hour. Right?
Okay. So it's an automated type process.
It's as automated as possible in this case.
It doesn't have to be everybody in the company.
It doesn't have to be everybody. Obviously, the more the better, because you have what it's called the wisdom of the crowds. But it's up to you, right?
Yeah.
And this platform basically allows you to refine and customize this process as much as we want. And obviously, this is the slide that I showed before is the process that takes place at BAT. But different companies might use the platform in different ways.
So you can still travel at speed, but hopefully get the better results, right? I mean, again, you want to hire the right candidate. Right?
Exactly, and exactly. It's one of those things where it's you might have a little bit of a higher waiting time, longer waiting time and higher cost at the beginning, but the value add, down the track is enormous, as you can see from, quick tests and experiments. So this is about it, basically, and this is also why it's important to test, right? Because you never really know what is the value of taking part in these processes, and we get similar questions from government departments or companies we work with, where they say, this is great, I think this is okay, let's not waste time testing it, let's not spend time basically collecting new data.
Yeah.
Right?
Can you scale it up fast? I mean, I know that some of our participants are large companies, right?
Mm-hmm.
So is it practical? You can scale if it works.
Yeah.
What tests work? I mean, have you seen it scale fast? I mean, these government departments or somewhere?
Absolutely. Yeah. So that is a key component of what we do. We would actually only advise to test solutions that can then be scaled up. If we know that something cannot be scaled up, there's no point in testing it. Yeah. And when you think about solutions that can be scaled up, you always need to have a little bit of like a cost-benefit analysis, right? Mm-hmm. Where you say, is this worth it? Am I going to generate enough savings or enough revenues that actually makes it worth it to invest in a little bit of testing and data collection sometimes?
It's a complex area, right? And everybody wants to be in it, or how do you start?
Yeah. So the best place to start is basically to just read whatever is out there. There's a couple of books that are the typical pop psych type of books that you can find in any Apple. One is called Thinking Fast and Slow.
So Thinking Fast and Slow, okay.
Yeah, from Danny Kahneman, who's a Nobel Prize in economics. And he basically, he's a psychologist, and he says that our brains are almost like two brains into one. And we have a system 1, which is the one we activate when we have to think fast, and the system 2 is the one that takes a little bit more energy to activate. And this book is great because it tells you how you are, victim of these biases. And
so like a system 1 is a think fast.
Pretty much, yeah. Without even realizing. Yeah. Yes. So the system 1 is the one you activate when you just have to cross the road, for instance, or come to work every day. Things that you do without even thinking about it. And the system 2 is the one you activate when you have to plan a holiday or plan a company strategy and so on. Mm. Now, unfortunately, most of the times we should apply system 2 to make better decisions. But our brains are hardwired to make fast and efficient decisions with the least amount of energy consumption as possible. And a lot of times, unfortunately, we make the bad decisions because of that, because we just activate system 1 instead of system 2. So that's a great book, I think, as an intro. The other great book is Nudge, which is a book that is written by Professor Richard Thaler, who is a professor of economics at Chicago University, who won this year's Nobel Prize in economics. And he basically says, well, if we know that people are not fully rational, how about we design policies and programs to make sure that we help people to make better decisions, right? And that's the
These aren't too hard books to read. I mean,
very easy, very super accessible, not academic textbooks. Okay. And if you want to apply behavioral economics in your company, you do not need to have a PhD in psychology or economics. You can, you can learn about it, and obviously there's so many opportunities to engage with experts in the field as well. So BAT obviously has an office in Australia, but there's multiple government departments now that have their own behavioral insights teams.
Sure.
And so there's so many opportunities to engage with practitioners as well.
Great. Okay. So for our participants out there, they can either try one of these 2 books. They could contact you, of course.
Sure.
But I guess the trick is to start somewhere. Anything else from you today?
No, I think that's about it. Yeah.
Thanks
for having me.
Think slow, and that makes it counterintuitive. But I mean, for example, use Adzuna. Do something a bit different. Look, I hope you've enjoyed today's session, and we'll have another one in a couple of months' time too. Let me first just check some questions, see if there's another question. No, I think that is about it. But look, feel free to shoot any other questions to us, and we'll steer them to Dr. Guglielmo. Thank you very much for your time today. I really appreciate it, and thank you all.